Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. This is a fantastic series of presentations we've already had this morning, which I think were very thought-provoking. I don't have any images, so you can look at these gorgeous images as they flash by. Brendan, I think you took them, I'm not sure. What I wanted to do was, on the basis of the kinds of things that were presented this morning, there were all kinds of ideas that I thought were pretty amazing, and I just wanted to go back to visit some of those ideas and talk about them a little bit. And I'm going to try and keep track of my timer. Let's see how that goes. First of all, I think a lot of people are confused when they hear the word landscape. And they're going, what's landscape? Like, is landscape Kensington Market? I thought landscape was landscape. So that's a bit confusing. But there is a history about how who's in charge of designing cities. And it used to be planners and architects, but for the last 20 or 30 years, or maybe more, there's been a push that maybe landscape architects should be involved. And landscape architects should be looking at the broader terrain of the city as a kind of starter. And when you see people's presentations this morning, you saw a lot of people talk about the terrain and the impact of the terrain. And so there is a term called landscape urbanism, which is an interesting term to take a look at. And there are also interesting thinkers in landscape architecture right now. Nina Marie Lister, who's going to present, she teaches at Ryerson, is phenomenally interesting in terms of, she wrote a book recently called Projective Ecologies. She's talking about the field of landscape architecture breaking out of that field. The field's kind of evolving immensely. And so she's talking about what ecology means, how the environment's treated in a larger way. And that's a course that she's been running out of Harvard. And then there's another famous landscape historian in Toronto called Mark Laird. Mark Laird's now teaching at U of T. And he wrote a really interesting book recently called Gardening, History of British Gardening or something like that. And it's a phenomenal book to get your hands on because he talks about how gardening is different than landscape architecture. And in the early part of the 19th century, landscape architecture was really about gardening. It was run by women who were interested in the weather, in birds and bees, flora and fauna, how to grow different things, immensely productive sense of this larger ecology that Mark critically says is missing in our current ideas of landscape architecture. So there's a push to kind of move ahead with these things. That spawns all kinds of issues. In the United States, there's a group called the Cultural Landscape Foundation. We organized a conference of them to come to Toronto to talk about what a Cultural Landscape Foundation meant. Their push is, and there's a booklet they've done called What's Out There. Actually, Brendan did it. And it's a database where you can search significant landscape architecture pieces in the city of Toronto, and it's linked to the same database for San Francisco and New York and other cities. The push there with the Landscape Foundation, they wouldn't call themselves preservation advocates. They really think it's by education and by knowledge and by literacy that people learn about landscapes. And so they are famous. Recently they had a fight with the Frick Museum in New York. The Frick Museum was going to build on the landscape garden, and the Cultural Landscape Foundation pointed out why it was really important. That landscape piece was, the garden was very important, and they won. So there's an issue about, in terms of, if we're talking about how do you engage or how do you implement cultural landscapes, it may be through actions like intelligent conversations, op-ed pieces in the paper where you save the Frick Garden. I was really interested today to hear Kathy talk about Bala Falls, because my friends Liz and Edwin are fighting wind turbines in Prince Edward County, and they're actually having some level of success by talking very intelligently about what a cultural landscape is and the impact, demanding that the province look at the impact of cultural landscapes, the turbines on the cultural landscape of Prince Edward County. And they've had some level of fair success, which I think is important. And then in Toronto, we worked on a book called The Ward. And The Ward was about an immigrant group, snapping it, was about the immigrant area. It was defined geography. And in my mind, we were actually talking about a cultural landscape. And we're actually, I would say the Ward book is a cultural landscape study. And what's interesting about it is that it's looking at that landscape from the perspective of many voices. So the Ward book, we basically contacted lots of people and said, tell us about your perspective, your view on what this landscape consists of, what this history consists of. And interestingly, it's all been wiped out, so it's really talking about an intangible rather than tangible heritage. But in my mind, we were trying to get at something that would tell us more about, and if you look at the definition, the PPS definition, cultural heritage landscape, the Ward book fits as a cultural landscape study. We've tried a number of these to try and understand collectively what these places mean to us. And we did another one, there's a little postcard in the back of the room called the Field Guide to Tactical Heritage Urbanism. It leads you to a website, the ECOMOS website, where we talk about something we did with Jane's Walks in the spring. It was with ECOMOS Canada and Jane's Walk. And we said, well, let's understand what cultural landscapes may mean to people. And we presented to a group of Jane's Walk volunteers the Faro Convention, which is a convention that was developed in Europe. It's about human rights. It basically says everyone has the right, as a human right, to their heritage. Everyone has a right to their culture. And so you said, what does that mean in Toronto? Does it mean anything in Toronto? We're not Serbia and Croatia fighting each other and destroying each other's monuments. What does it mean for us? And it's very interesting. Many of the speakers who end up leading the walks tend to be Aboriginal people. They talked about what it does mean from them in a very real perspective, what the Faro Convention might mean to them. But again, it was an exploration of show me the place. So Jane's Walks walk through a neighborhood, talk about the character of that neighborhood. So that was a deliberate attempt on our part, a tactical attempt, to try and understand what these places mean. Checking my time. We did. There are examples where a designation under the Heritage Act might make sense for a cultural landscape. The one that comes to my mind is Richard Serra's sculpture in King City. Richard Serra did this amazing, when he was quite young, he did an amazing sculptural piece called Shift, which maps the topography of the landscape by a structure. And that's sitting now in a farmer's field. And there was some threat that it might be demolished. It went to the Conservation Review Board and was turned down, recommended it to be turned down, because the Conservation Review Board said, well, there's no community that knows about this thing. People in King City don't know about Richard Serra's sculpture. A bunch of us came back and said, well, you know, the community that knows about this is the intellectual art community across the world. They're kind of interested in this. And City Council, King City City Council agreed with us and designated the property. We actually did a cultural landscape study some time ago in Toronto. We did a study for the Toronto Islands. We were asked to look at making the Toronto Islands a heritage conservation district, and we met with the people who live on Wards Island. They said, don't do this to us. We've got these ramshackle little buildings that are already heavily controlled. We don't want further build structure control. We want something else. And so we actually proposed a cultural landscape study, and we did this study based on, we got a set of principles, an agreement of principles about ecological environment, sharing the land, working together, very straightforward principles. They were adopted by the Parks Department and the yacht clubs and residents in the neighborhood. In my mind, it's interesting that the provincial, as Julian showed, the provincial policy statement sits above planning and the Heritage Act. And so, in my mind, the provincial policy statement says you can do an identified study, shows geographical boundaries, and talks about the character of the space. If that's done, it's a cultural heritage landscape. It should be protected as such. So in my mind, the Toronto Islands study actually constitutes a cultural heritage landscape that should be protected under the provincial policy statement. It's interesting because, geez, I've got lots to go. I'll get quite this. Another person to read maybe be Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett's coming out with another book. His first is a series of books. The first one was called The Craftsman, and it was about making things. The second book was called Together, and it was about working together. And his third book is called Open City. And he's arguing that open cities built with open structures allow more things to happen than cities built with closed structures. And he has a deep concern that heritage preservation may lead to closed structures rather than open structures. We need to kind of think that through pretty carefully. Last night, the Architectural Conservancy had its awards night, and the Paul Oberman Award went to the Queen Richmond project, which was a development at the corner of Peter and Richmond. So it got a major award. It would unlikely be able to be built if the Heritage Conservation District standards go in and tell us the kinds of development that should occur on those streets. So heritage conservation is something that's, in terms of a cultural landscape study, is something that needs to be possibly considered as something that's about experimentation, about the intangible, about celebration, about ritual, about play. And it's very hard to regulate those things. And maybe we need to step back a bit and say regulation has a certain role, certain important to do, but there may be other things in our environment that we need to look at differently. So we may need to say, are there other ways we could do these things? I would suggest, for example, that if we're going to develop a system about implementing cultural heritage landscapes in Toronto, that we work with the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Economic Development and Culture Department, and the Parks Department to develop an overall strategy about how to celebrate our heritage. The Moccasin Walk is a perfect example of something that's difficult to regulate, but something that's worth celebrating. And I was amazed by the presentation about the Moccasin Walk. Mississauga's program I thought was spectacular. And what was interesting about it was the listing process. I think the idea about simply flagging things and saying these may have value. The City of Hamilton is doing a similar thing now. That this may have value. It was a system developed in Toronto, not a full designation, but simply a listing, which allowed a much wider range of things to occur, so that you didn't have to go the whole route of a designation process. And I think Bob Alsop's urban taxidermy term, I'm not sure that I like it, Bob, but
you're not supposed to.
But I appreciate what it's trying to do, and I think the issue of addressing use and how do we deal with use, how do we understand use, and in fact the study, if we need to focus, if we want to focus on how to preserve things, maybe we need to look at certain things like how do we keep mom and pop shops alive? Or what is it about gentrification? How does gentrification work? My solution for Kensington Market is to recognize gentrification is happening, but look at the new immigrant areas in the city where tower renewal is happening, those other suburban neighborhoods, figure out how to reduce the zoning implications on those neighborhoods, which are shrink-wrapped about what they can do in those neighborhoods. Allow greater uses to happen, create new Kensington Markets, learn from Kensington Market, figure out how more areas can be created like that have the diversity and character that exists in Kensington right now. It's also possible by doing that, by understanding gentrification better, we may be able to actually have a solution to the retention of Kensington Market. And I think I'm almost out of time. I think that's all I wanted to say. I do want to say, however, before I leave the stage, that I have huge respect for the city's Heritage Preservation Services group, and I think they're struggling with a very difficult set of problems about how to deal with things. But I do think opening up to other scenarios, figuring out other ways to address a larger cultural agenda is the way to go. Thanks very much.